Hello, everyone. Welcome to Medium in Conversation. My name is Kaushik Vishwanath. I'm on the content team here at Medium, where I focus on working with business writers. And today I'm speaking with Ximena Vengoechea, the author of the new book, Listen Like You Mean It, Reclaiming the Art of True Connection. Now, before I introduce Ximena, I should confess at the outset that I have a special relationship to this book. Before I joined Medium in 2019, I worked as a book editor at Portfolio, a business and personal development imprint of Penguin Random House. And while I was there, I received an intriguing proposal for a book about how to be a better listener with your friends and family, with strangers, and with colleagues at work. I'd seen a lot of books and proposals before about effective communication or having difficult conversations, but these were usually written by psychologists or professors or self-help gurus. But the author of this particular proposal had a slightly different background. She was drawing on her experience as a user researcher at some of Silicon Valley's top companies like Pinterest and LinkedIn and Twitter. And it was full of the most delightful hand-drawn illustrations done by the author herself. That author, of course, was Ximena Vengoechea, and I'm pleased to say that I played a role in convincing Portfolio to publish her book. Now, I left the publisher long before the book was finished, so while I worked with Ximena in the early stages, it's really come a long way since then, and it's truly fantastic to see the finished book today. It's a delight to read, and I really learned a lot reading it, and I hope you'll find the same. So Ximena, welcome to Medium in Conversation, and it's a pleasure to have you, and congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you. It's so exciting to be here, and particularly in conversation with you, who has played such a pivotal part in this book becoming a reality. So I feel like we're full circle, and I'm excited for our chat.
Indeed. Before we get started, I should tell everyone attending that we're going to leave a little time at the end of our conversation for questions from you, the audience. So if at any time during the hour you have a question that you'd like to ask Ximena, just drop it in the Q&A that you should see at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to your question at the tail end of this conversation. So Ximena, I'd love for you to tell us about how your experience as a user researcher got you interested in the topic of listening. Why did you feel like it was something that people needed help with, and what made you realize that you had a unique perspective to bring to it?
Yeah, so as a user researcher, my role is to help companies get to know their users in order to build better products. And the primary skills are really learning how to facilitate a conversation, how to help people open up, even when they're giving feedback that might not be something you want to hear about, and how to listen, and how to listen really deeply. And as I started working on that skill set, it just became increasingly clear to me that it had much broader applicability outside of just a classic user research study in the lab or in the field. And I started to also feel like even in my own life, I was able to apply those skills and begin to see some fruit from those efforts. And so I felt like, I could be in a group meeting and just sense a little bit more what the group's dynamics were, or whose voices weren't included, or, in a one-on-one, whether with a friend or at work, I was able to intuit a little bit more deeply what that other person was experiencing. And so as I was seeing these benefits come over from my research training, it just felt really compelling to me to share that with folks, to help them become better listeners. And I think it was always something that I was interested in, but it became much more urgent these past few years, where I think it's safe to say, I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear that, this moment is particularly polarizing, and we're culturally, politically pretty divided. and the way we communicate because of those divisions, the way we communicate because of social media and the internet, the way we communicate because of the pandemic, all of those things have changed how we communicate and relate to each other. And so it felt that much more important to try and get this message out about how to be a better listener, because ultimately, I believe that's part of what helps us build stronger relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, before I read your book, I used to think that being a good listener just involved sort of not dominating the conversation and not interrupting folks. But after reading your book, it turns out that there's a lot more to it than that. So what have you found that people tend to miss or get wrong about what it means to be an effective listener?
Well, certainly does take some of what you're talking about, but yes, there's more to it than that. I think one of the most important things when it comes to listening, and something that we don't do very often, is just going much deeper than the surface. So I think most of us would say we're fairly decent listeners. You know, we can hold a conversation, we can be polite, but generally that's happening at a surface level. So we're hearing enough of the literal to stay engaged, but we're maybe missing the subtext, the meaning, and a lot of times we're missing the emotion. So what's that other person experiencing, or what's their emotional tie to what you're talking about? And so one of the things I think that is at the core of making that shift from this kind of surface level listening to what I call more empathetic listening is to come in with a listening mindset and to bring in qualities like humility, curiosity, and empathy into conversation really intentionally as a way to get to know someone.
Mm-hmm. And how do you know, from a user research standpoint, you're listening for particular things, like what kind of interaction or reaction a user is having with a particular product, but outside of that context, how do you know what to listen for?
Well, it's interesting because in research, there is a set goal. So there's a specific set of questions that you are trying to uncover. And I think it often feels like our conversations are far more random than that. And to some degree they are, but actually every conversation there's some kind of hidden need. There's a reason that this person, whoever it may be, is bringing up this topic with you and not someone else, or that the group is talking about this. And often there's some need at the root of that conversation, which is a little bit of it's a different idea, right? We don't really think of conversations as having something we need to discover. But when you start to tune into that, that's what helps you understand what is that person experiencing. So for instance, you know, someone might have a need to be supported, or someone might have a need to be affirmed, or someone might have a need for advice. And so at a really high level, it's shifting, you know, the idea of a conversation being a sort of random interaction that may or may not have meaning to, oh, there's probably something here. There's probably some kind of need, and that can be the sort of target that guides your listening.
Mm-hmm. And you have a whole chapter in your book about basically the roles that people play as listeners, or you kind of have a typology, I think, of how people approach listening. Can you say a little bit about that, and like what the right role is, if there is such a thing, when you're being a listener?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about these default listening modes, which are essentially the way that we naturally listen in conversation. So each of us has a particular filter, right, that we hear things through. Usually it's informed by our early relationships, our personality, things like that. And it means that when we go back to that need that I was talking about in conversation, it means that we're tuning into specific things that may or may not actually be what's needed in conversation. So just to get more specific and provide a few examples, one example of this kind of listening mode would be the problem solver. So a problem solver hears everything through the lens of a problem to be solved. That's a great mode. Like, how helpful, right? You're brainstorming, or you're stuck on a problem, what a gift to have someone hear what you're saying and say, oh, you know what, you could try XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that not every conversation has a problem, or if it does have a problem, the other person might not actually be asking you for advice. That might not be their need. And so there's no mode that's good or bad. The key is that you have to shift the mode and identify what's actually needed, and is my mode relevant. So for example, if someone is saying, maybe someone's saying to their manager or to a friend, I have so much work on my plate, and they're kind of listing through it. A problem solver might hear that as, oh, I need to help. I need to pull something off their plate, or, pitch in and do my part. And maybe that's what's needed. Or maybe that person actually just wanted you to know that they're working really hard. and that was it. And if you pull something off their plate, they might feel micromanaged, or like you don't believe in them in some way, right? So that's one example of a mode. And I'll mention one other, which is the identifier. So when you take an identifying listening mode, you're kind of scanning for, how can I relate to this situation or to what this person is telling me? And that can be really lovely when the person wants to feel affirmed. So if someone says, oh, I'm having such a hard time with my boss or my spouse or whomever, and you hear that and you say, oh gosh, I know what that's like. Let me share that I know what that's like. Yeah, I feel for you. I've experienced that too. That can feel really great. It can feel like, okay, that person is no longer alone, or it can feel really dismissive if that's if that was not what they were looking for. It can feel like, oh, okay, so now we're talking about you. I wasn't quite done sharing how I was feeling, but okay, on to you, right? And so that's where uncovering that need and identifying your mode, and just having a moment with yourself of, oh, my instinct is to respond in this way. Is that right here? Does that make sense here? Or might there be something else that's needed?
And does that process of identifying what the other person needs from the conversation, is that just like a skill that you develop, or can you actually ask the other person what they're looking for?
You can absolutely ask. There are cues that can help along the way. There's what I call informed intuition. So this is, based on your experience with that person. What have you observed so far? So is this a friend who tends to come to you for career advice, right? Then you've kind of built a sort of knowledge base of how to interpret some of their conversations. So, you want to use that when you have it. You don't always have it. But certainly you can ask. And my only recommendation there is to think about whether it makes sense to ask at the beginning or not. So some people might be, it would probably be easier if you started every conversation knowing exactly what the other person wanted, but it's often hard to do that. It's hard for us as individuals to even be able to say what we need. So I recommend giving them a little bit of space to share. And then, maybe you have a hunch about what they might need and you want to get confirmation of that. So you can say, hey, I think what I'm hearing is X. Would it be helpful if Y? Like, would it be helpful if I shared a similar experience I have about that? Or would it be helpful if I played devil's advocate and shared, what I think might be happening on the other end of this discussion, or whatever that mode may be? Would it be helpful if I offered some solutions? So those are some ways that you can go about it. And if you really are just not sure where to start, then you can always just say, would you like me to listen or respond? Because sometimes there's no response that's actually necessary. It's just having the space to share something. And that's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I found, like one of the chapters in your book that I didn't even think would be an aspect of listening that would fill an entire chapter, was the idea of just playing back what the speaker is saying, and using that as a mode of of listening? Like, so could you say a little bit about why that's important or how to use that?
Yeah, so playing back what you've heard can serve a few functions. One kind of gets at what we were talking about earlier, which is you're validating the other person's experience. So if someone says, I'm dealing with X and Y, and I'm facing these challenges, and I've got this thing that I have to deal with over here. Sometimes just saying, it sounds like you're really stressed can be enough, because often we're not necessarily seen and heard in that way. Often the response is like, well, here's what you should do about that. Right. And so just reflecting back, like, this is sort of the feeling that I'm getting from what you're saying, can be really affirming. The other function that playing back what you've heard serves is it's clarifying. It's clarifying for you, and it can be clarifying for the other person. So sometimes we're working through ideas as we speak. Some people do this, in one-on-one conversations with friends. Sometimes it's a meeting, and it's a group of people who are kind of trying to figure something out. And if you can be the person who is listening and tracking that input and able to make sense of it and say, okay, we're getting all these, everybody's kind of talking around this thing, but I think what I'm hearing is ... Does that sound right? Am I getting that right? That gives people an opportunity to say, yes, you've got it. And oh, that's what I was trying to say. Or like, yes, you've got it. I feel so heard. Or no, that's actually not right. What I really mean is this other thing.
Mhm.
And so I think it can be really helpful both when you're creating space for someone and providing that validation, and also when you can kind of see either the person or the group is a little bit stuck, and you can provide some clarity of, hey, this is what I'm picking up based on what you're putting down. Is that right?
Yeah. So in that example, you sort of talked about, both one-on-one situations as well as group situations, and I'm curious whether effective listening means something different in those contexts, or if it's the same set of skills that are broadly applicable.
I would say it's a similar set of skills. The difference is that in a one-on-one, to some degree, you have more control because there's just fewer voices competing. There's a little bit less that you're tracking, right? It's one other person's experience that you're trying to understand. The more people you add to the mix, the more complex it gets, because you're not just making sense of what is one person's need, but now let's say you're in a meeting with 10 people, what are their 10 needs, right? And how might those be interacting? And so I think, particularly for group conversations, I think observation becomes very, very important in those kinds of discussions, where you can observe, okay, whose voice is not getting heard, whose voice is dominating, who's getting the credit for these ideas, whether or not they are that person's ideas, who's actually making the decision here. Is anyone making the decision here? Right. So there's a lot more to potentially track. And I think that's where observation becomes very, very useful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've also noticed many times in group settings or in meetings, you go into the meeting with sort of an idea of what the discussion is supposed to be about, and I don't know, someone or a group of people get onto a particular track, and suddenly you find that this conversation is about something else entirely. You have a lot to say in the book about sort of what to do when a conversation gets derailed, and the role of a listener is also to is not just to sit back, but to also help guide the conversation. So how do you do that? How do you get a conversation back on track from when it gets derailed?
Yeah, and I think this happens often. And you're right. It's not just about, listening and observing and then just kind of mentally saying, ooh, we're off track and just kind of leaning back. It is about more actively stepping into the conversation. But I think you can, use techniques like reminding folks of why we're here, right? If there's a meeting with an explicit agenda, pointing that out, saying something like, yeah, this sounds like a really rich line of discussion. I do want to make sure we go back to, the purpose of the meeting or the question that we're all trying to answer, and just, it's sort of a gentle way of acknowledging. So you're not just totally cutting people off, you're acknowledging the conversation that's happening and also gently nudging back to the conversation that you've kind of all agreed on that you actually want to have. I also think creating a little bit of pressure can help in terms of using things like the time, like just literally being, hey, we have 15 minutes left. Do we still want to keep talking about X or do we want to return to Y, right? Because often people, it's not intentional. People are not going on tangents intentionally, usually. And so just raising some level of awareness of, hey, we came here for this. We're now talking about that. Do we feel good about that? Do we want to double down on that? Or given the time, should we move on? And so there are things like that that you can say to just kind of bring everybody back to the present.
Yeah, that sounds like in some ways a lot of responsibility and a lot of work for one person to do. And in an ideal world, everyone would sort of be cognizant of these things and intentionally want to be a better listener. But we know that that's not always the case, and some people bear that responsibility more than others. So I'm curious, both from the perspective of wanting to ensure that uh, you know you're taking care of yourself, as well as making sure that you are also heard, and not the only one doing the listening. How do you maintain that balance of your own needs versus the other person's in a conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think it is important to acknowledge that, right? Is that like a conversation it's not all speaking and it's not all listening, and relationships are not all, based on one or the other. It is a give and take. And so you do want to make sure that your voice is heard too. And so the phrase that I use in the book, which is like what we're trying to avoid, is becoming a listening martyr, which is you are essentially just a vessel for someone else and you're kind of receiving everything and like you're giving them that empathetic ear and they're taking it. And so some of the things that you can do is, honestly, part of it is evaluating certain relationships and getting a sense of, when we talk about that give and take, is that give and take there? Or is it more that it's really just take? Because there may be certain relationships that when we audit them in that way, we realize, wow, this person kind of consistently leans on me as a venting session, or for a cathartic, like just like dropping everything on me and I'm kind of left holding the bag and I don't get to share very much. So doing an honest assessment of who in your life might be what I would call a taker and who is more of an energizer, which is where you are getting energy from the conversation. Also, you have a nice give and take. And then, possibly maybe that's a signal for some of those relationships that it could be worth distancing yourself from that person and setting some boundaries with that person. If it really is a consistent, like, wow, I'm never getting my voice heard here. That's not always possible, right? There are some people who we work with or we're related to, or we have some other strong tie to, where that's not an option. And so I think in those cases, it's more about setting boundaries within a conversation. It's about knowing how to exit a conversation gracefully. And that can be anything from, time boxing it as a technique. So if you know there's someone who generally leaves you pretty drained and you can't avoid it, can you, meet them in a place where, for instance, a busy restaurant where tables turn over fast, as opposed to lingering in a cafe that no one's ever going to boot you out, right? You're looking for little constraints. Or can you just say up front, I only have 20 minutes for our chat, but I'm all ears for those 20 minutes, but just like putting that limit up front. And then, also getting to a point where you say, great, like this has been great. I have to run now. You don't have to give a lengthy excuse. You don't have to share, why you're getting out of the conversation. But just saying, I've really got to get going. It was great talking to you, or even saying, I don't want to take up any more of your time. So, let's catch up later. Those are all ways that you can kind of gracefully extricate yourself from a situation that feels draining to you.
Could it also, I'm thinking of some situations where there are just some topics that are, it's not necessarily the relationship or the person who is draining, but certain topics of discussion that are either very emotionally charged or just difficult conversations to have. Could you find a point at which you would say, okay, let's stop talking about this now and let's talk about something else?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's nothing wrong with taking a time out and saying it. I think the most important thing is to just be explicit, and to the degree that the relationship can handle it, just honest about, why you're hitting the pause button, because it can be jarring for the person on the other side to hear that you don't want to talk about something anymore. So just saying, I'm noticing that I'm getting a little bit emotional about this, and I'm actually having trouble hearing you. Is it okay if we hit pause? Right? Most people are going to say, oh, I'm sorry. Or like, you know what? I'm feeling that too. Yeah, let's hit pause. I think where we can get into trouble is honestly when we try to push through. We're having a difficult conversation. We're kind of getting that like feeling in our throat that it's getting tense, or the tightness in our chest. And, for whatever reason, whether we're convinced that we can win this argument, or, change this person's perspective, or just feel embarrassed that we're feeling that way. Maybe the other person is cool as a cucumber and we're just like, oh my God, I can't handle this right now. Often we push through, and what happens when we push through is we go past our limit. And then it's really not productive, because we can't hear anything anymore, because we're so aware of what's happening for us that we really can't hear the other person. And it's really draining, and it doesn't feel good, right? So by kind of powering through, we risk making it worse. And so it actually can be better to just hit pause and say, whoa, this is kind of hitting me pretty hard. Or if there's not enough trust there, just hitting pause and saying, you know what, like let's say you're in something as seemingly benign, maybe as a performance review, and you don't have an intimate relationship, close relationship with your boss, just saying like, you know what, I think I need a bio break. Would that be okay? Again, they're probably going to say yes, right? So even just taking, a few minutes to yourself of deep breathing, and then coming back and saying, okay, now I think I can manage this a little bit better, can help.
And what about going in the other direction? Like I definitely know situations where there's a topic that is likely to be emotional or difficult to talk about, and because you're aware of that difficulty, you just avoid it. So I'm curious, how do you enter into some of those conversations that are necessary but are difficult to have?
So I think the best thing here is just to name it, because sometimes that tension, it's true, like a conversation may be difficult, but it's amplified because we know it might be difficult or we expect it to be difficult, but we haven't said it aloud. And so this was something that I had to do in research sessions if we were going to cover something personal, something that might be difficult, even things like personal finances that can bring up a lot of feelings for people. And so I would just start off by saying, hey, we're going to talk about some things today that, might get a little uncomfortable. And that's something that you can do in a conversation with someone who you're like, hey, I want you to know, like, here's my intention, right? We're going to talk about some things that might be a little uncomfortable. I want you to know that where I'm coming from is I'm trying to get to know you better. I'm trying to understand you better and your point of view. So like, please know that that's my intent, right? It's not to provoke or push you too far. And like, that could happen in this conversation. It could feel like that.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes just saying it aloud, it just kind of, it like releases a little bit of the pressure, because then you're both like, yeah, okay, this might be hard. And okay, but you've kind of shared the intention behind it. And that's a helpful reminder. And frankly, it's a helpful reminder for you too, especially if you're the one who's bringing up that conversation of like, okay, why am I bringing this up? Why am I a little worried that this might get heated or emotional in some way? Okay, my intentions are good. Like, let me, kind of ground on that.
Yeah. Your example of the performance review and the ways in which that might be a difficult conversation also makes me wonder about different interpersonal dynamics where there's there's explicitly a power dynamic involved. You're not on the same, you're not on a level playing field with your manager. So how do you navigate those those power imbalances in a conversation?
I mean, I think part of it is trying to address that playing field that you're talking about, where there's, so you have a hierarchical relationship. One person has more power than the other, and it can feel really hard to have an even relationship, an even conversation as a result of that. But I think part of it can be, if you are the person who is in a position of power, creating a space for the other person, allowing the other person to potentially even take up more space than you because you have this power already, and kind of giving them some by giving them some space, I think is part of it, but also modeling what you're looking for. So if you're looking to have a conversation where you get honest and vulnerable in some way, then you, as the more powerful person, as the leader, whatever your role may be, you can begin to model that because it makes you more human, right? Mm-hmm. And I think on the other side, if you're the person who is in the less powerful, whatever that means in the situation, position, I think part of it is trying to connect with that person on more of a human to human level, as opposed to fixating, for instance, on their status or their title. And that's really easy to do, especially when you're in the lesser position, where it can be intimidating. You're like, well, but this person is a VP, or this person, has a decade more of experience than I do. And if you can remind yourself, well, this person is a person who's made lots of mistakes in their lives, just like me. And maybe it's not that important that they're a VP for this given interaction. I think that can lower the tension a little bit. And so each party is able to kind of, one comes down a little bit and the other comes up a little bit, then you can meet each other in a different, a more equitable zone.
Yeah. I see we have a number of questions from the audience, but before we get to that, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the process of actually putting this book together. I know that you wrote a lot of it during the pandemic, and you were also a new mom at the time, and this is your first book. So I'm curious what that process was like and what were the challenges, and what did you find rewarding about the writing process?
Yeah, so I definitely do feel like I had all of the hurdles thrown at me. So I'm like I've made it to the other side, so I can talk about it now. Yeah, I think what was challenging, I think will not be a surprise, which is, it's hard to feel like you have enough time to work on a project when you've got a 9 to 5, a kid, pandemic, and all of that stuff. So that was definitely a challenge from day one. But for me, I'm a big believer in using existing pockets of time, and making use of your sort of natural productivity cycle. So a thing I know about myself is that I do my best thinking in the morning, my best sort of like creative and strategic thinking. And I'm kind of like done by like late afternoon. I can do a very different kind of work. I can have conversations. I can, you know, edit things, move them along, but like the big picture thinking, I really can't do at that point. And so I used what I knew about myself basically, and tried to use that to my advantage. And so I would map out, okay, I'm going to do some writing in the morning. I'm going to do illustrations at night, because illustrations are really, it's a meditative process for me. It's very relaxing. It's very calming. My brain has kind of been thinking about the material all day on its own. And I wasn't going to be anxious going to sleep. Like if I try and write at night, I'm going to have trouble falling asleep. So just knowing those things about myself really helped. And then also, not to be underestimated, like having at least somewhat of a support system. I'm out in Santa Fe now and we have family nearby, but for a while it was just my husband and I in San Francisco without childcare. And I had to lean on him a lot to be able to get any work done. And that was, that's, I think, a big part of any project is there's probably somebody else behind the scenes who's helping create the space and time to make it happen. So I feel very lucky to have had that kind of support, and to also have been able to kind of pull from whatever pockets of time I could to, make progress along the way.
The other people I know that you've relied on to make this book happen are just all the other folks that you spoke to, and whose expertise you drew on. So I'm curious, like what types of people you spoke to, in addition to drawing on your own experience, and what you learned from them. I know that it's a lot to get through in a few minutes, but like, what were the big takeaways for you?
Yeah, so I spoke to other listening professionals across a number of different fields. So I spoke to reporters, I spoke to life coaches, I spoke to therapists. And I think what was interesting to me was how much overlap there was in terms of techniques. I think they all have a different end. You're trying to do something different with those skills for each scenario, but there was a lot of overlap in terms of techniques. And I found it particularly useful to hear about how everyone recovers, because anyone who does this kind of listening on a daily basis, really consistently as part of your profession, knows that it can be tiring, because you're putting in a lot of effort. That's what takes it from the surface to, a deeper place. And so it was really insightful and also encouraging to me to hear what their techniques were for managing their energy levels and recovering from these deep listening conversations.
Great. We have a number of audience questions. So with the help of my colleague Gloria, who's been collecting these, I'm going to ask you some of them, and let's spend the next few minutes just talking to the audience, shall we? So the first question is from Danelle Papier. I hope I'm saying that right. The question is, what would be a good and effective way to ask someone to determine if they actually heard what you mean by what you say?
Can you repeat that?
What would be, what would be a good and effective way to ask someone, um, basically, what's a good way to ask someone if they actually heard what you mean by what you say? So you spoke a little bit about the role of, as a listener, playing back what you heard. I think uh, I think this person is asking, Danelle is asking, how do you ensure that you are being heard in a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, it's tricky, but you're finding that balance in conversation of addressing their needs and your needs. So I think part of it is not necessarily putting a bow on someone's portion of the conversation, but sort of acknowledging when you've gotten to a point where you feel like, okay, I think we've addressed this, and now there's something I want to share. And I think you can say something like, was there anything else you wanted to, you can ask, you can say, was there anything else you wanted to talk about on that? I know we've talked about X, Y, and Z. If not, I was actually hoping that I could share something that's been on my mind. Right. And that's a way of, again, you're not pulling the rug out from underneath that person. You're saying, hey, we've talked about this, and I'd like to, share what I'm feeling too. Are you ready for that in some way?
Yeah, I guess that you addressed how you open the space for yourself to be heard. I think the piece of the question that I'm still wondering about is, how do you get, is it even possible to ask the other person to sort of play back what you just said, and ask them to really verbalize and acknowledge what you've told them?
Yeah, I think, yes, there are ways of doing that. And I think some are more pointed than others, and I think it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. So for instance, if you're seeking clarity, if you're kind of a verbal processor and you're talking through a challenge or an idea, you might finish and just ask, like, does that make sense? Right? Like, is there a through line there? Those are things that you can say to just set the other person up to say, yeah, I think the through line is this, or, well, what I heard the problem is, this. That's if you're seeking clarity on what you're verbalizing. I think if you're looking for something like validation, like you really want to be seen, or you feel like the person is not seeing you, it gets a little bit trickier in that if you were to ask someone like, well, what did you hear me say? It could sound a little bit accusatory, or a little bit like you're setting them up to fail in some way. When really what you want is just to be heard. And so I think if you're at that point where you want that reflected back, you're like kind of really craving someone to reflect that back. Honestly, I think the best thing you can do is try and go a bit deeper yourself and get to that, sentence for yourself, which might be the hardest thing. And which usually sounds like, I think what I'm trying to say is I'm scared, or, like, I think what I really mean is that I am lacking confidence in this area, or whatever it may be. I know that maybe is a little bit of a frustrating response, because you do want the other person to say that for you on your behalf. But it's so much harder to control or coach someone else to give that to us. It's actually a little bit easier for us to open that up. And by virtue of doing that, it can cause the other person to say, oh, okay, yeah, so you're scared, right? It can make that a little bit easier if they haven't done it already.
Short of just handing them a copy of your book, right?
That's the other option.
Another question from an anonymous asker is, any suggestions on how to deal with a colleague who is a poor listener and always interrupting, a person who is thinking about what they want to say next instead of listening to you?
Yeah, so this is another one where maybe just drop that book off on their desk. Yeah, this is really hard. I think that I guess I would say, like, do your best to try and understand why they're interrupting. Is this a nervous tick? Is this enthusiasm, even though it's annoying? Like, I totally hear that, like, it's not welcome. Is this like, oh, passion for an idea and like needs to get it out? What might be driving it? Because I think it's useful to know that, because it can inform your approach. So for instance, if you know that this person is kind of like a font of ideas and is always ready to chime in, then you can even set the stage of, I want to get through these 3 items first. You always have such good ideas, and I know that this is going to spark some great ideas from you, and I can't wait to hear them. My only ask is that we get through like these 3 things, and then we'll open it up for some of those ideas. So you can sort of, if you have a sense of what might be driving some of that behavior, or even if you don't, you can just, especially in a formal setting, like the office, it's much more natural to set these kind of ground rules for a conversation and say, hey, here's how I want to use our time together. I'm envisioning I'm going to take 15 minutes to talk through this, and then I want to open it up for critique or whatever it may be. So that would be my suggestion. Try and understand, what's driving it, and then, especially in an office setting, adding a little more structure to help you kind of protect that part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Sandra Lawakis, I hope I'm saying that right, wants to know, what are some techniques to re-energize after a day of listening? I work in a profession that involves a lot of listening, and I'm pretty depleted by the end of the day. And to add to that, I'm an introvert by nature.
Yes, I really hear that. I completely understand, because I think this was a very common point in conversations with other listening experts, is you are really exhausted. So in terms of recovery, I think different techniques work for different people, but things that you can try or consider: having quiet time, if you're able to. I know that's not possible for everyone, but cultivating just, some sense of quiet at home can be helpful. Journaling. You didn't mention the specifics of your role, but particularly if you are in a role where you're listening to topics that can just be like pretty heavy to process. So on the caregiving side, for example, if you're hearing stories that are intense, it can be useful to kind of separate yourself from someone else's experience, particularly if those are negative or intense experiences in some way, and reminding yourself, kind of setting a boundary. And so you can use mantras like, this isn't mine to keep. I don't need to hold on to this. I can let this go, right? And that can also help. Some people find movement is really helpful because it gets them out of their brain, and just kind of back into your body. But the truth is, I would honestly recommend whatever feels really restorative to you naturally. Like, what are the things that you're drawn to, and that you probably wouldn't be ashamed to tell somebody else? Because sometimes the things that we're drawn to are like 5 hours of Netflix, and then we don't feel so great after that. So that would be my only caveat, is like, maybe there's a hobby or a pursuit or an activity that you enjoy and find, for me, like drawing is really meditative, and you enjoy that. And as long as it wouldn't be embarrassing, or you wouldn't be ashamed to share it with someone else, it's probably worth exploring.
There's one anonymous questioner who wants to know if how much overlap there is between your book and nonviolent communication, and if that played a role in your book and your thinking.
Yeah, I didn't go deep into it, but I do think that a lot of those techniques, as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of the techniques across listening professionals in general are pretty similar, which is you're bringing in humility. You're not trying to convince the other person of something. You're trying to uncover what they're in the conversation for and respond in kind. So it's very much, there's certainly, they're all kind of like informing each other, I would say, on that level. I think that all of the listening professions tend to rely, on these sort of core tenets. It's just how it's executed and to what end. Obviously, a negotiation is going to be a very different kind of conversation than a user research study where you're trying to understand, how someone interacts with the product.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony Crudis wants to know, any strategies for increasing self-awareness to help recognize when you may not be listening as intently as you should be?
Yeah, so the book has quite a few exercises and self-reflection prompts, and they're really meant to help with self-awareness. I'm glad that you brought this up because I do think this is a big part of the listening process, is being aware of your own tendencies in conversation and when they might be getting in the way. One thing I'll say that can be useful, in the moment is, as you are participating in a conversation, if you are tuning into, ooh, something's happening for me emotionally, or, oh, I'm getting really distracted, like I think I'm bored in this conversation, or you catch yourself, checking your device again, I think just noticing that and observing it and giving it a second in your mind of, oh, I just picked up my phone for the 5th time during this conversation. Oh, I'm thinking about what I want to make for dinner. Okay, let me come back to the present, right? I think every time you observe that about yourself and just hold it for a second of, oh, this is what I'm doing, now release, can help. That's like a regular practice that in every conversation, as you feel that happening, and you'll get so much more in tune with it over time, and it'll be much easier to return to the present once you've done that.
There's another anonymous questioner who wants to know, how do I find a way to be present with my pain in the presence of another? That seems like a heavy question.
Present with your pain, is that what? So without knowing a ton about the situation, I think the question is like, how do you have a conversation in which you're feeling pain and listen through that?
I think so.
Yeah, I would say that's hard. I think that to the extent that you're able to, one, acknowledge it, say it out loud, like, or at least to yourself of, hey, this is how I'm feeling. If you have that relationship with someone else, to say, this is how I'm feeling, it might get in the way, and I'm going to try and be aware of that. I think that goes back to sort of naming it and setting the stage for having a more open conversation. And then again, going back to what we were talking about earlier of, don't push through it if you don't have to. And you really don't have to most times. I think we just get used to the idea that we have to. But remembering that, if it gets to a certain point, if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel comfortable, or if you just have gotten to a point where you can't hear the other person, it's best to hit pause.
Amy Todd asks, I worry that the people we say are draining to listen to are the people who have big needs and in greatest need of listening. What is your perspective on why some people are more draining to listen to than others? Do we have a responsibility in general to increase our threshold or empathy for those who are draining?
It's a great question. And I think it's worth also, saying that those people, this category, right? We probably all fit in it at some point or another. So it's less that, there's this like group that we're kind of walking away from. I do think it's somewhat circumstantial, and we probably all have relationships in which we are the friend who is taking more from our other friend, or, there's a certain topic that we just sometimes can't shut up about, right? That happens. And so I do think that's important to keep in mind, is that it's not necessarily fixed. And I think in some ways, knowing that we can all experience that and we can all be on the sort of like taking side of the table, I hope creates some empathy for when we're on the receiving end too. And so I don't take it lightly that, you might have to distance yourself from somebody in a conversation or in a relationship. It's not where I would start, certainly. I do think, yes, absolutely, like bringing that empathy into conversation and working to uncover those needs is useful, but also I don't want anyone to feel like that it's their responsibility to go so far that they can't function as an individual, right? So that they have to solve for other people, because ultimately, in most cases, it's really not our responsibility to do that for someone.
Yeah. We are almost at time, so I have a fun final question from another anonymous asker, which is, what is your favorite illustration in the book, and can you show us?
Ooh, I actually really love the illustration at the end of the book. I guess, yes, I can grab it. Hold on. So there's an illustration in the conclusion, which is one of my favorites, which I think just captures well the feeling that you get when you're in the presence of a really good listener. Let me see if I can find it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but it basically captures the feeling that I think we've all had when you're in the presence of a really good listener and you just walk away and you're just like refreshed and inspired and you feel understood and accepted and valued. It's just like all the warm fuzzies. So that's this one, which basically is an image of a sort of wilting flower on one side and then kind of a fully blossoming and just vibrant flower on the other side, illustrating the difference between what it can feel like when you're in the presence of someone who's really, really deeply listening.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Ximena. That brings us to the end of this iteration of Medium in Conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who attended, and there will be more of these in the future with other prominent guests like Ximena. So keep an eye out for those announcements, and make sure to follow Ximena on Medium, where she's active, and go find her book in a bookstore near you. Thanks again.
Thanks, guys. This was so fun. Thank you.